My husband spit in my face in front of his mother and sister, and they cheered. I walked out silently without a word. But just 5 minutes later, one phone call shook the house. The entire living room went silent. Can you even imagine what it feels like to have your husband spit in your face, right in front of his mother and sister, and then to hear them applaud? Because that's exactly what happened to me. And in that gut-wrenching moment, as his saliva dripped down my cheek, I realized the twisted game they'd been playing with my life was finally, brutally over. The applause echoed in the sudden, sickening silence. 3 pairs of hands, clapping in perfect, synchronized rhythm, like they'd rehearsed this moment their whole lives. My mother-in-law, Patricia, sat there in her favorite armchair, that satisfied, chilling smile plastered across her face, a smile I'd learned to dread over 12 agonizing years. My sister-in-law, Janet, lounged on the couch, watching me like I was the main event in her favorite trashy reality show. And David, my husband, the man I had married, loved, and supported through everything, he just stood there, his face twisted in pure disgust, staring at me like I was something foul he'd scraped off his shoe. Finally, Patricia purred, her voice dripping with approval. Finally, someone put her in her place. The argument that led to this? So trivial I can barely even remember. Dinner plans, maybe. Or picking up their dry cleaning. Lately, everything I did was wrong in their eyes. I was too slow, too fast, too loud, too quiet. They probably thought I breathed wrong. But this was different. David had simply walked over, without warning, no escalation, and spit directly in my face. Pure, calculated humiliation. The moisture ran down my cheek, and I stood there, utterly frozen. 12 years of marriage, all the gradual changes, the small cruelties that had somehow become our normal, nothing had prepared me for this. This wasn't anger. This was contempt so complete, so absolute, that in his eyes, I ceased to exist as a human being. That's what happens when you don't know your place, Janet added, examining her perfectly manicured nails. Maybe now she'll learn to keep her mouth shut. My place? I almost laughed at the bitter irony. They had no idea what my place truly was. I didn't wipe my face. I didn't cry. I didn't scream or fight back, or do any of the things a normal person might do when their spouse publicly degrades them in the most humiliating way possible. Instead, I did something that surprised even me. I smiled. It wasn't a happy smile. It wasn't even an angry one. It was the smile of someone who had just realized that the game was unequivocally over. You're absolutely right, I said quietly, my voice steady despite the chaos in my soul. Everyone should know their place. David looked utterly confused. This wasn't the reaction he'd expected. He'd grown accustomed to my tears, my apologies, my desperate attempts to smooth things over and restore peace. For months, every confrontation ended with me backing down, accepting blame, promising to do better. But that woman, the one who apologized for existing, who made herself smaller and smaller to accommodate their growing cruelty, she had died the moment his saliva hit my face. I turned and walked toward the kitchen, feeling their eyes burning into my back. Behind me, I could hear them whispering, probably already planning their next move in this twisted game they'd been playing with my life. What they didn't know was that I'd figured out the rules months ago. In the kitchen, I pulled out my phone. My hands weren't shaking. That actually surprised me. I thought I'd be falling apart right now. Instead, I felt calmer than I had in years. I scrolled through my contacts until I found the name I was looking for. Michael, attorney. My brother answered on the first ring. It's time, I said simply. Are you sure? His voice was gentle, but professional. We'd had this conversation before. We'd planned for this moment. He spit in my face, Michael. In front of his mother and sister. They clapped. The silence on the other end stretched for several long seconds. When Michael spoke again, his voice had changed completely. I'll be there in 30 minutes. Don't say anything else to them. Don't explain. Don't argue. Don't apologize. Just wait. I've been waiting for 3 months, I reminded him. I know, he said. And now it's over. I hung up and just stood there in my kitchen. The kitchen where I'd cooked thousands of meals for people who saw me as nothing more than a servant. Where I'd cleaned up after gatherings I wasn't truly invited to join. Where I'd swallowed my pride so many times I'd forgotten what it even tasted like. The house was eerily quiet now. No more whispered conversations from the living room. No more satisfied laughter. Just silence. I walked back toward the living room and that's when I saw them. All 3 of them were standing in the hallway, their faces pale, staring at me like they'd seen a ghost. Who did you call? David's voice had lost all its earlier bravado. I didn't answer. I just walked past them to the front window and looked out at the street. A black sedan was already pulling into our driveway. Sarah. Patricia's voice was sharp now, laced with worry. Who did you call? I turned to face them. And for the first time in months, I felt like myself again. Not the diminished version of myself I'd become, but the woman I used to be. The woman who had opinions and boundaries and the strength to enforce them. I called someone who knows exactly where everyone's place is, I said. The doorbell rang. The sound seemed to echo through the house like thunder. David, Patricia, and Janet all looked toward the door, then back at me, then at each other. For the first time since I'd known them, they looked utterly uncertain. The doorbell rang again, more insistently this time. "Aren't you going to answer it?" I asked pleasantly. "It's your house, after all." David moved toward the door with reluctant steps, like a man walking toward his own execution. When he opened it, Michael stepped inside, briefcase in hand, wearing the kind of expression that had made him one of the most feared divorce attorneys in the state. "Good evening," he said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "I'm Michael Peterson, and I represent Mrs. Sarah Peterson. I have some documents that require your immediate attention." The transformation in the room was instantaneous. Patricia, who had been so confident and smug just moments before, seemed to shrink into herself. Janet's face had gone completely white, and David, my husband, who had humiliated me, who had spit in my face like I was nothing, looked like he was about to be sick. "Documents," he managed to croak. Michael opened his briefcase with deliberate precision. "Divorce papers, a restraining order, and a few other items that I think will be of particular interest to everyone here." He handed David a thick stack of papers, then turned to Patricia and Janet, giving them each their own sets of documents. "Ladies," he said with cold politeness, "you're also named in several of these proceedings." The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the kitchen clock ticking from 3 rooms away. This was the moment I'd been working toward for 3 months, ever since I'd finally admitted to myself that my marriage wasn't just troubled. It was abusive. Not physically abusive, though tonight had certainly crossed that line, but emotionally, systematically, deliberately abusive. They had spent years breaking me down, making me question my own worth, my own sanity, my own right to exist in spaces they deemed theirs. What they didn't know was that for the past 3 months, I'd been documenting everything. Every cruel comment, every manipulation, every time they'd isolated me from friends or made decisions about our shared life without consulting me. I'd recorded conversations, saved text messages, and built a case that would ensure I never had to apologize for breathing again. Michael looked around the room with the satisfied expression of a man who'd just delivered exactly the kind of justice his client deserved. "Mrs. Peterson," he said, turning to me, "shall we discuss the timeline for your transition to your new living arrangements?" I nodded, not trusting my voice just yet. 3 months of planning, 3 months of secret meetings and careful documentation, 3 months of pretending to be the same broken woman they thought they'd created. And it had all led to this moment. Behind me, I could hear David frantically flipping through pages, his breathing getting faster and more panicked with each document he read. Patricia was clutching her papers like they might disappear if she let go. Janet was just staring at her set, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. "There must be some mistake," David finally said, his voice high and desperate. "Sarah wouldn't. She couldn't." "Oh, but she did," Michael replied smoothly. "Mrs. Peterson has been quite thorough in her preparations. I think you'll find everything is very much in order." I looked at the 3 people who had made my life a misery, who had convinced me I was worthless, who had celebrated my humiliation just minutes before. They looked so small now, so powerless. And for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe again. The next morning, I woke up in a hotel room, a strange new reality after 12 years of marriage. The sheets were crisp and white, untouched by the weight of someone else's expectations. For a moment, before memory crashed back, I felt profoundly peaceful. Then I remembered David's face when Michael had handed him those papers. The way his hands had trembled as he read through document after document, each one more damaging than the last. The way Patricia had sunk deeper into her chair with every page she turned. The way Janet had gone completely silent, her usual stream of cutting remarks dried up like a poisoned well. My phone buzzed with texts I didn't bother to read. I knew what they said. Apologies, explanations, promises that things would be different. The same lies I'd been hearing for years, just delivered with more desperation. Michael had instructed me not to respond to any contact from them. "Let them sweat," he'd said as he drove me to the hotel last night. "Let them wonder exactly how much you know and how much evidence you have." The truth was, I had more than they could possibly imagine. It had all started 4 months ago with a phone call that was meant for David. A woman's voice, breathy and intimate, asking if Danny was coming over tonight because her husband was working late again. When I told her she had the wrong number, she'd laughed and said, "Oh, is this the wife?" How embarrassing. That single moment had shattered the last of my illusions about my marriage. Not because David was having an affair, somewhere deep down, I think I'd always known. But because of how the woman on the phone had spoken about me, like I was a joke, like I was something to be pitted and dismissed. I'd hung up without saying another word. But something fundamental had shifted inside me. For the first time in years, I got angry. Really, truly angry. Not the quiet resentment I'd been carrying, but a clean, bright fury that cut through all the fog of self-doubt they'd created around me. That night, while David slept beside me, probably dreaming about his affair, I'd made a decision. I was going to find out everything. Every lie, every manipulation, every cruel calculation that had brought me to this point. And then I was going to use that knowledge to take back my life. The investigation had been easier than I'd expected. David was sloppy, overconfident. He kept his phone unlocked around me because he'd trained me so well not to question him about anything. His computer password was our wedding anniversary, a detail that would have been touching if you weren't using that computer to coordinate his betrayal. What I found in his digital life made me physically sick. Not just the affair, though that was devastating enough, but the conversations with his mother and sister, planning ways to make me more manageable. The jokes about my appearance, my intelligence, my worth as a human being. The casual cruelty of people who saw me as an inconvenience to be tolerated rather than a person to be loved. There were text threads going back years where they strategized about isolating me from my friends. Patricia had actually written out a plan for making me financially dependent on them, suggesting David discourage me from working and then use money as a weapon to control my behavior. "She's too independent," Patricia had texted to Janet. "We need to make her understand that her comfort depends entirely on keeping us happy." Janet's response had been even worse. "Don't worry, Mom. A few more years of this and she'll be so broken down she won't even remember who she used to be." Reading those words had felt like dying and being reborn at the same time. The part of me that still hoped for reconciliation, that still made excuses for their behavior, had died instantly. But something stronger had taken its place, a determination to prove them wrong about everything. I'd called Michael that same night. My brother had always been protective of me, but he'd also respected my marriage enough not to interfere. When I told him what I discovered, the silence on the phone had stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. "Sarah," he'd finally said, his voice thick with emotion. "How long has this been going on?" "Years," I'd admitted. But I think I was too close to see it clearly. I kept thinking, if I just tried harder, if I just became whatever they wanted me to be. "This isn't your fault," he'd said firmly. "None of this is your fault. But we're going to make sure they face consequences for what they've done." Michael had connected me with a discreet private investigator who specialized in domestic cases. Within weeks, we had documented everything, the affair, which turned out to involve a married neighbor named Rebecca whose husband traveled frequently for work. The financial manipulation, including credit cards Patricia had opened in my name without my knowledge. The systematic emotional abuse that had been so gradual, I'd almost convinced myself it was normal. But the most damaging evidence had come from something I'd started doing on my own. I'd begun recording conversations with a small device Michael had given me. Not every conversation, just the ones where I sensed they were planning something particularly cruel or revealing something important about their true feelings. The recordings were devastating. Hours of audio where they discussed me like I was a problem to be solved rather than a family member to be cherished. Patricia's voice on tape coaching David on how to make me feel guilty for spending money on myself. Janet's laughter as she described spreading rumors about me to other family members, ensuring I'd be isolated at gatherings. The worst recording was from just 2 weeks ago. I'd been in the kitchen making dinner when I'd heard them talking in the living room. Something about their tone had made me turn on the recorder. "She's getting suspicious," David had been saying. "Rebecca thinks she might know about us." Patricia's voice had been dismissive. "What's she going to do about it? Leave? She doesn't have anywhere to go. We've made sure of that. Besides," Janet had added, "even if she found out, who would believe her? We've spent years making sure everyone knows how unstable she is, how jealous and paranoid she gets." They had been planning my discrediting before I'd even discovered the affair. They had been preparing to gaslight me, to make me question my own sanity, to ensure that even if I found proof of their betrayal, no one would take my side. But they had underestimated me. Or rather, they had underestimated who I used to be before they'd spent years trying to erase that person. I was Sarah Peterson, sister to one of the state's most successful divorce attorneys. I had a master's degree in psychology, which meant I understood exactly what they'd been doing to me and how to document it properly. I had friends they didn't know about, resources they'd never bothered to investigate, and a strength they'd assumed they'd completely destroyed. Most importantly, I had something they'd never expected me to develop: patience. For 3 months, I'd continued to play the role of the broken, submissive wife while methodically building a case that would destroy them. I'd smiled and apologized and made dinner and pretended everything was normal while secretly recording their cruelty and documenting their crimes. The hardest part hadn't been gathering evidence. It had been pretending that nothing had changed, continuing to let them hurt me while I waited for the right moment to strike back. Every insult I'd absorbed, every humiliation I'd endured, every time I'd bitten my tongue when they treated me like garbage, it had all been in service of this moment. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. Michael's name appeared on the screen. "How are you holding up?" he asked when I answered. "Better than I expected," I said, and realized it was true. Despite everything, despite the end of my marriage and the destruction of what I'd thought was my family, I felt lighter than I had in years. Good, because they're already trying to retaliate. David called my office at 6 this morning, claiming you've had a mental breakdown and demanding we return his stolen property. I laughed. Actually laughed. Stolen property? Apparently, he considers your evidence gathering to be theft. He's also claiming you've been having an affair, which is rich considering the circumstances. Let me guess. Patricia's idea? Probably. She called 20 minutes after David did, suggesting we could all sit down and work this out like reasonable adults. She seems to think this is some kind of marital spat that can be smoothed over with the right conversation. The delusion was almost impressive. Even faced with documented evidence of their systematic abuse, they still couldn't accept that their actions had consequences. What happens next? I asked. Next, they discover that this isn't just about divorce. The financial fraud Patricia committed by opening credit cards in your name carries criminal charges. The harassment campaign they conducted against you could constitute intentional infliction of emotional distress. And David's affair with a woman whose husband is a prominent local businessman might have some interesting social consequences. My stomach clenched with something that might have been guilt. Michael, I don't want to destroy them. I just want them to leave me alone. Sarah. His voice was gentle but firm. They spent years trying to destroy you systematically, deliberately, cruelly. They celebrated your humiliation. They planned your emotional breakdown. They stole from you, lied about you, and turned your own marriage into a weapon against you. He was right. I knew he was right. But 12 years of conditioning don't disappear overnight. The choice is yours, Michael continued. We can settle this quietly, with generous terms for you and minimal consequences for them. Or we can let them face the full legal and social ramifications of their actions, but you need to decide before they realize how much trouble they're actually in. Through the hotel window, I could see the city waking up. People heading to work, to school, to lives that made sense. Normal lives where spouses didn't spit in each other's faces, where mothers didn't plot against their sons' wives, where families functioned with basic respect and human decency. I wanted that life. I wanted to be one of those people walking purposefully down the sidewalk, heading towards something good instead of running away from something terrible. What would the quiet settlement look like? I asked. Generous divorce terms, the house, most of the assets, and binding agreements that they'll have no contact with you going forward. They avoid criminal charges and public embarrassment. You get your freedom and financial security. And the alternative? Full prosecution. Public exposure of the affair, the financial fraud, the systematic abuse. They could face jail time, bankruptcy, complete social destruction. I closed my eyes and tried to imagine David in jail, Patricia facing criminal charges, Janet's perfect reputation in ruins. 3 months ago, the thought would have horrified me. But that was before I'd listened to hours of recordings where they laughed about my suffering. I need to hear one of the recordings again, I said suddenly. Sarah, please. I need to remember exactly who they really are. Michael was quiet for a moment. Then I heard the sound of him typing. Seconds later, my phone buzzed with an audio file. I pressed play and heard my own voice first, asking if anyone wanted more coffee. Then Patricia's response. Asterisk, she's so desperate to please, isn't she? Like a dog begging for scraps. Asterisk, Janet's laughter. Asterisk, at least dogs are useful. Asterisk, David's voice, cold and dismissive. Asterisk, sometimes I wonder what I ever saw in her. She's gotten so pathetic over the years. Asterisk, Patricia had replied. Asterisk, you saw a doormat. And that's exactly what we turned her into. Asterisk, I turned off the recording and sat in the silence of my hotel room. These were the people who had pretended to love me, who had stood at my wedding and promised to cherish me as family. These were the people who had systematically destroyed my self-worth while making me grateful for the privilege. When I called Michael back, my voice was steady and clear. I want them to face the full consequences, I said. All of them. The war was just beginning. 3 days after the divorce papers were served, David showed up at my hotel. I was sitting in the lobby with my coffee, watching the morning news when I saw him through the glass doors. He looked terrible, unshaven, wrinkled clothes, the kind of desperate dishevelment that comes from not sleeping for days. The hotel staff tried to stop him, but his voice carried across the marble floor as he demanded to see his wife. Former wife, I corrected silently. The papers had been very clear about that. Sarah, please. He was standing 10 feet away from me, close enough that I could see the red rims around his eyes. We need to talk. I looked at him over my coffee cup. This man I'd shared a bed with for 12 years, and I felt nothing. Not anger, not sadness, not even the faint echo of love. Just a mild curiosity about what he thought he could possibly say that would matter now. He glanced around the busy lobby, apparently expecting privacy for whatever performance he planned. When I didn't move, he reluctantly took the chair across from me. This has gotten out of hand, he began, using the same tone he'd once used to explain why I was overreacting to his mother's latest cruelty. I know we've had our problems, but a divorce? Criminal charges? Sarah, this is insane. Is it? I took another sip of coffee. Which part seems insane to you? The part where you spit in my face? Or the part where you and your family spent years systematically destroying my self-worth while laughing about it behind my back? His face flushed. Those recordings, you can't use those. Recording people without their consent is illegal. Patricia had clearly done some research and fed him this line. Actually, in this state, only one party needs to consent to a recording, I said, almost smiling. Since I was present for every conversation I recorded, they're perfectly legal. The color drained from his face. You planned this. All of it. You've been planning to destroy me. No, David, I said. I planned to save myself. There's a difference. He leaned forward, and for a moment, I saw a flash of the man I'd fallen in love with so many years ago. Before his mother had convinced him that loving me was a weakness, before he'd learned that cruelty could be disguised as strength. Sarah, I know I've made mistakes. We all have, but we're family. Families work through problems together. They don't destroy each other in court. Family? I repeated the word like it was foreign. David, do you remember what your mother said when she found out I'd had a miscarriage 3 years ago? His eyes started away from mine. Of course, he remembered. She said it was probably for the best, since I'd probably just raised another weakling anyway. And you, my husband, the father of that lost baby, you just sat there and nodded. Mom was upset. Your mother was cruel, and you enabled her cruelty because it was easier than standing up for your wife. I sat down my coffee cup. That's when I should have left. But I stayed because I thought families work through problems together. I thought if I just tried harder, loved you more, made myself smaller, eventually you'd choose me over her. David was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was softer. I did love you, Sarah. I still do. No, I said firmly. You loved having someone to blame for everything wrong in your life. You loved having someone who would absorb your mother's poison, so you didn't have to deal with her yourself. You loved having a scapegoat. That's not true. I pulled out my phone and opened the audio app. Would you like me to play the recording from last month where you told your mother that you sometimes wonder if you'd be happier if I just disappeared? Or maybe the one where Janet suggested you could probably get me committed if I became too much trouble. He went completely still. You don't have a recording of that. But I did, and we both knew it. I'd been in the bathroom when that particular conversation happened, and I'd left the recorder on the coffee table. The audio quality was perfect. David, let me make something very clear to you. For 3 months, I documented everything. Every conversation, every text message, every email. I have recordings of your mother coaching you on how to gaslight me. I have evidence of the credit card she opened in my name. I have proof of your affair, including hotel receipts and photos Rebecca sent you that I found on your phone. His hands were shaking now. Sarah, if this gets out, my job, my reputation. You should have thought of that before you decided to humiliate me in front of your family. I was angry. I said things I didn't mean. I did things I regret. But destroying my entire life isn't going to fix anything. I studied his face, looking for any sign of genuine remorse, any acknowledgement of the years of pain he'd caused. What I saw instead was the same selfish panic I'd seen the night Michael served the papers. He wasn't sorry for what he'd done to me. He was sorry he was facing consequences. Your life isn't destroyed, David, I said. It's just finally being exposed for what it really is. My phone buzzed with a text from Michael. Asterisk Rebecca's husband found out about the affair. He's filing for divorce too. Might want to stay away from social media for a while. Asterisk, I showed the message to David, watching his face go ashen. Oh, God, he whispered. Paul knows. Paul Richardson was a prominent local businessman. The kind of man whose social circle overlapped significantly with David's professional network. The kind of man who wouldn't quietly tolerate being made a fool of. Apparently, Paul hired his own private investigator when he got suspicious. Found everything we found, plus some things we missed. I put my phone away. Did you really think you could carry on an affair for months in a town this size without consequences? David buried his face in his hands. This is going to destroy everything. My job? My standing in the community? Your job at the accounting firm that handles Paul Richardson's business interests? I asked. Yes. I imagine that might become awkward. He looked up sharply. How did you? David, you never were as careful as you thought you were. And you certainly never paid attention to what I actually knew about your life. I stood up, suddenly tired of this conversation. You all made the mistake of assuming I was stupid just because I was kind. You confused silence with ignorance, submission with weakness. Sarah, please, we can fix this. I'll do anything. Therapy, counseling, whatever you want. I'll cut off contact with my mother and sister if that's what it takes. For just a moment, I wavered. This was what I'd wanted for so many years. For him to choose me, to put our marriage first, to acknowledge that his family's treatment of me was wrong. But it was too late. Much too late. You can't cut off contact with your mother and sister, David, I said. Because in about 2 hours, they're both going to be arrested. The words hung in the air between us like a death sentence. David's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. Arrested, he finally managed. Patricia for identity theft and credit fraud. The credit card she opened in my name constitutes felony fraud. Janet for conspiracy and harassment. It turns out there are laws against coordinating campaigns to isolate and emotionally abuse family members. You can't be serious. I'm completely serious. Michael filed the charges yesterday. The police are serving warrants this morning. David stood up so quickly, his chair tipped over backward. Sarah, you can't do this. They're family. They're all the family I have left. They're criminals, David. And they're not my family. They never were. My mother is 72 years old. You want to send a 72-year-old woman to jail. I want a 72-year-old woman to face consequences for her actions. Age doesn't excuse cruelty. And it certainly doesn't excuse fraud. He was pacing now, running his hands through his hair. There has to be something, some way to fix this. I'll pay back the money. I'll make them apologize. With what money? You're about to lose your job, remember? And apologies don't undo years of systematic abuse. My phone rang. Michael's name on the screen. Excuse me, I said to David and answered. Hi, Michael. It's done. Both arrests went smoothly. Patricia tried to claim she was too fragile for handcuffs, but apparently that didn't work. Janet demanded to speak to her lawyer, which is funny since she's about to discover her lawyer has a conflict of interest. Conflict of interest? Paul Richardson uses the same firm. They can't represent Janet in a case where their primary client is the wronged party. I looked at David, who was watching me with desperate eyes, trying to read my expression. Thank you, I told Michael. I'll call you later. When I hung up, David was staring at me like I was a stranger. It's done, I said simply. Sarah, please. No. The word came out harder than I'd intended. No more pleasing. No more begging. No more making excuses for people who never showed me an ounce of genuine respect. I picked up my purse and started toward the elevator. Where are you going? David called after me. To see my lawyer. We have a lot of paperwork to finalize. Sarah, wait. What about us? What about our marriage? 12 years can't just disappear because of one mistake. I stopped and turned back to him. He was standing in the middle of the hotel lobby, looking lost and broken and utterly bewildered by the collapse of the world he'd built on my suffering. One mistake, I said quietly. David, spitting in my face wasn't a mistake. It was the inevitable result of 12 years of treating me like I didn't matter. It was what you'd always wanted to do, and you finally worked up the courage to do it. That's not true. Yes, it is. And deep down, you know it is. Just like you know that your mother and sister are getting exactly what they deserve. Just like you know that Paul Richardson has every right to destroy your career over what you did to his marriage. I turned back toward the elevator, then paused. You want to know the truth, David? The real truth about our marriage. The elevator doors opened and I stepped inside. I stopped loving you 2 years ago. The night you laughed when your mother called me pathetic. The night you agreed with her that I was lucky anyone would have me. I died a little that night, and I've been dying a little more every day since. But I'm not dying anymore, I said as the doors began to close. For the first time in years, I'm finally alive. As the elevator carried me away from the wreckage of my marriage, I felt something I hadn't experienced in so long I'd almost forgotten what it was. I felt free. The last thing I saw was David standing alone in the lobby, surrounded by strangers, finally understanding what it felt like to be abandoned by the people who were supposed to love him. It was a lesson he should have learned a long time ago. 2 weeks after Patricia and Janet's arrests, I was sorting through the belongings I'd retrieved from the house when my doorbell rang. I'd finally found a small apartment across town. Nothing fancy, but it was mine, and that made it beautiful. Through the peephole, I saw a woman I recognized, but had never actually met, Rebecca Martinez, David's affair partner. She was younger than I'd expected from the photos I'd seen on his phone. Probably early 30s, with a kind of polished appearance that came from having both time and money to maintain it. I almost didn't answer. What could she possibly want to say to me? But curiosity won out. Mrs. Peterson? Her voice was softer than I'd imagined. Hesitant. I'm Rebecca Martinez. I think we need to talk. I opened the door but didn't invite her in. I can't imagine what we'd have to discuss. She looked nervous, fidgeting with her purse strap. I know you probably hate me, and you have every right to, but there are things about David, about the whole situation, that you don't know. Things I think you deserve to hear. Against my better judgment, I stepped aside and let her enter. She took in my sparse apartment with guilty eyes, probably realizing that while she'd been playing house with my husband, I'd been displaced from the home I'd lived in for over a decade. I brought you something, she said, pulling a manila envelope from her purse. Photos, text messages, evidence that might help your case. I took the envelope, but didn't open it immediately. Why would you help me? You're the one who destroyed my marriage. Rebecca's face crumpled. No, I'm not. That's what I came to tell you. I didn't destroy your marriage, Mrs. Peterson. David did. And he destroyed mine too. She sat down heavily on my couch, looking suddenly much older than her years. I need to start from the beginning, she said. Because what you think happened between David and me, it's not the whole truth. I remained standing, arms crossed, waiting. 6 months ago, I was having problems in my marriage. Paul and I were seeing a counselor, trying to work through some issues. David was my neighbor, and he seemed so understanding, so sympathetic. He told me his marriage was over, that you two were just staying together for appearances. That's a lie. I know that now, but at the time, he was very convincing. He said you'd grown apart, that you barely spoke anymore, that you'd both agreed the marriage was dead, but neither of you wanted to go through the hassle of divorce. I felt a familiar flash of anger. Even in his affair, David had been rewriting our history to make himself the victim. He showed me text messages, Rebecca continued. Conversations that he claimed were between the two of you, where you both agreed to see other people discreetly until you could figure out the logistics of separating. He forged text messages. I think so. I mean, I never questioned them at the time, because they seemed to fit with everything else he was telling me. He was so detailed about your supposed arrangement. So matter-of-fact about it. Rebecca opened her purse and pulled out her phone. But then last week, after Paul found out and confronted me, I started really thinking about those messages, and I realized I'd never actually seen them on your phone. David always showed them to me on his phone, claiming he'd screenshotted them. She handed me her phone, showing me a series of text messages, allegedly from me to David. These aren't from me, I said immediately. Look at the phone number. That's not even my number. I know. I figured that out when I tried to look up the number online. It doesn't exist. David created fake conversations to convince me you were okay with the affair. The calculation behind that deception was breathtaking. David hadn't just cheated. He'd constructed an elaborate lie to manipulate Rebecca into participating in his betrayal. There's more, Rebecca said quietly. Remember that night you went to visit your sister about 3 months ago? The weekend trip. I nodded. I'd gone to see my sister Karen in Baltimore, needing some space to process everything I'd learned about David and his family. David told me you were actually at a hotel with someone named Marcus. He said you'd finally started seeing someone, too, and that you were probably going to ask for a divorce soon. My blood ran cold. Marcus is my sister's husband. I was visiting my sister and her family. I know that now, but David showed me hotel receipts with your name on them, credit card statements showing charges at romantic restaurants. He made it seem like you were having this passionate affair while he was stuck at home alone. Those were forged too. They had to be, because now I know you weren't having an affair at all. You were just trying to survive what he and his family were doing to you. Rebecca's voice broke slightly on the last words. Mrs. Peterson, I need you to understand something. I'm not a homewrecker. I would never have gotten involved with a married man if I thought he was lying about his situation. When David told me his marriage was over in everything but name, when he convinced me you were seeing someone else too, I thought we were all adults handling a difficult situation maturely. I sat down across from her, beginning to understand the scope of David's manipulations. How did you find out the truth? After Paul confronted me, I started questioning everything. I hired my own investigator, not to investigate you, but to investigate David, to find out how much of what he told me was real. She pulled out the manila envelope I'd set aside. It's all in there. Evidence that David has been running similar cons on other women for years. Before me, there was someone named Amanda. Before Amanda, there was Jennifer. Always married women having problems in their relationships. Always women he could convince that everyone involved was okay with the arrangement. I opened the envelope with shaking hands. Inside were photographs, printed emails, and what looked like a detailed investigative report. David is a serial cheater, Mrs. Peterson. And more than that, he's a serial manipulator. He specifically targets women who are vulnerable, tells them elaborate lies about his marriage, and convinces them they're not doing anything wrong. The first photo in the stack showed David with a woman I didn't recognize. Clearly taken at some kind of social event. They looked comfortable together. Intimate. That's Amanda Carlisle, Rebecca explained. She's married to a businessman who travels frequently. David convinced her that you knew about their relationship and approved of it. When her husband found out and threatened to expose everything, David simply vanished from her life and moved on to the next target. How many women? My investigator found evidence of at least 5 serious affairs over the past 8 years. Probably more casual ones that didn't leave as much of a paper trail. 8 years. I thought I'd been in a troubled marriage for the past few years, dealing with increasing hostility from David and his family. But the truth was, I'd been married to a stranger, a predator who used women's vulnerabilities against them while systematically destroying his wife's self-worth at home. Why are you telling me this? I asked. Why help me? Rebecca was quiet for a long moment. Because David destroyed my marriage too. Paul is filing for divorce, and he's making sure everyone in our social circle knows what I did. My reputation is ruined. My children are ashamed of me, and I'm going to lose half of everything I have. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. But the worst part isn't the social consequences or the financial cost. The worst part is knowing that I helped him hurt you, that I was part of the system he used to justify treating you like garbage. I looked through more of the photographs. David with different women, always looking relaxed and happy in a way I rarely saw at home. There's something else, Rebecca said. Something about his mother and sister that you need to know. What about them? They knew about all of it. My investigator found text messages between David and Patricia where she's actually coaching him on how to manage multiple relationships. She was helping him keep track of his lies. The room seemed to spin around me. Patricia knew about your affair? She knew about all the affairs? She encouraged them. There are messages where she's telling David that having other women will help him keep you in line because you'll be too insecure and jealous to make demands on him. I thought about all the times Patricia had made subtle comments about my appearance, my desirability, my worthiness as a wife. Comments designed to make me feel like I should be grateful that David stayed with me at all. Janet was involved, too, Rebecca continued. She helped David create fake social media profiles to communicate with his targets. She was the one who came up with the story about you having an affair with Marcus. The systematic nature of their conspiracy was overwhelming. It wasn't just that they'd been cruel to me. They'd been actively working to destroy my sanity and self-worth while enabling David's betrayals. Mrs. Peterson, I know this doesn't fix anything. I know I can't undo the damage that's been done to your life or mine, but I wanted you to know that what happened to you wasn't random cruelty or a marriage that just went wrong. It was deliberate, calculated psychological warfare. I set down the photographs, my hands trembling. They planned all of it, I said quietly. The isolation, the gaslighting, the affairs. They turned my marriage into a weapon against me. Yes, and they've been doing it for years. Probably to every woman David has ever been with. Seriously, my investigator thinks Patricia might have had similar arrangements with David's father before he died. There are hints in some old family letters that suggest a pattern going back decades. The thought that this might be generational, that Patricia had perhaps orchestrated similar psychological torture against other women in her family, made me physically sick. What are you going to do now? I asked. I'm going to testify in your divorce proceedings if your lawyer wants me to. I'm going to provide whatever evidence I have to help you get justice, and then I'm going to try to rebuild my life and figure out how to earn my children's forgiveness. She stood up, smoothing down her skirt with nervous hands. I know you have no reason to forgive me, Mrs. Peterson. I know I was part of something that nearly destroyed you, even if I didn't understand what I was participating in at the time. But I want you to know that David never deserved you. And what his family did to you, it's criminal. Not just legally, but morally. After she left, I sat in my quiet apartment, surrounded by evidence of my husband's systematic betrayal. Not just the affair I discovered, but years of affairs. Years of manipulation, years of using other women's pain to justify his cruelty toward me. The man I'd been married to for 12 years didn't exist. He'd never existed. The person I'd loved, made excuses for, and tried so desperately to please, had been an elaborate fiction designed to hide a predator. But as devastating as that realization was, it was also liberating. Because it meant that nothing that had happened to me was my fault. I hadn't failed as a wife. I'd been the victim of a carefully orchestrated campaign of psychological abuse. And now I had the evidence to prove it. When I called Michael that evening, my voice was steady and sure. I have new evidence, I told him. Evidence that's going to change everything. What kind of evidence? The kind that's going to ensure David never gets the chance to do this to anyone else. It was time to stop being a victim and start being a force for justice. Not just for me, but for all the women David had manipulated and destroyed over the years. The war was about to become a crusade. The conference room at Michael's law firm had never felt so charged with electricity. 3 weeks after Rebecca's visit, we'd assembled what looked like a war council. Michael, 2 associate attorneys, Rebecca and her lawyer, Amanda Carlisle, David's previous victim who'd flown in from Denver, and Jennifer Walsh, the woman before Amanda, who'd driven down from Philadelphia. I looked around the table at these women I'd never met before, but who shared an experience I understood all too well. Each of them had been carefully selected, manipulated, and discarded by my husband. Each had been convinced they were participating in an ethical arrangement between consenting adults. Each had discovered too late that they'd been pawns in David's twisted game. Ladies, Michael began, spreading out a timeline chart that covered the entire conference table. What we have here isn't just evidence of adultery. This is evidence of a systematic pattern of fraud, manipulation, and psychological abuse spanning nearly a decade. Amanda leaned forward, studying the timeline. She was in her early 40s, professionally dressed, with the kind of controlled composure that came from years in executive boardrooms. I had no idea there were others, she said quietly. David made me feel like I was the only person who'd ever understood him outside his marriage. That's exactly what he told me, Jennifer added. She was younger, maybe late 20s, with an artist's hands that trembled slightly as she pointed to her section of the timeline. He said his marriage was basically over, that you two were just going through the motions until you could afford to divorce properly. Rebecca nodded grimly. Same story, he told me, word for word in some cases. I studied the timeline, seeing my marriage laid out in black and white alongside David's betrayals. The pattern was clear and horrifying. Each affair had followed the same script, the same manipulation tactics, the same careful construction of lies. Here's what makes this particularly insidious, Michael continued, pointing to specific dates. David wasn't just cheating. He was using each affair to justify escalating abuse at home. Look at the timeline of Sarah's recordings. He pulled out transcripts of some of the conversations I'd recorded. Every time David started a new relationship, the psychological abuse at home intensified. It's as if having an affair gave him permission to treat his wife even worse. Because it did, I said, understanding flooding through me. He felt justified in his cruelty because he'd convinced himself I deserved it. After all, if these other women found him charming and desirable, the problem had to be with me. Michael's associate, Lisa Chin, pulled out another set of documents. But here's where it gets even worse. We found evidence that Patricia and Janet weren't just enabling David's affairs. They were actively recruiting his victims. The room went silent. What do you mean, recruiting? Amanda asked. Lisa opened a laptop and projected an image onto the wall. It was a screenshot of a social media group called Marriage Support Network. Patricia created this private Facebook group 3 years ago, Lisa explained. On the surface, it appears to be a support group for women having marital difficulties. But look at the member list. She clicked through several profiles. Jennifer, you were a member of this group in 2019. Amanda, you joined in 2020. Rebecca, you were added in 2022. I felt sick. They were hunting for vulnerable women online. It gets worse, Michael said. We've analyzed the group's activity logs. Patricia and Janet would identify women who posted about marital problems, particularly women whose husbands traveled frequently or who seemed isolated from their families. He clicked to another screen showing private message threads. They would befriend these women, offer support and advice, and gradually introduce the idea that sometimes marriages need flexibility to survive. They'd share stories about couples who'd found happiness through discreet arrangements. Jennifer's face had gone pale. I remember Patricia messaging me privately after I posted about feeling lonely while my husband was traveling. She was so understanding, so supportive. She told me about a friend of hers who'd found companionship with a married man whose wife was okay with the arrangement. She told me the same thing, Amanda whispered. Made it sound so mature, so civilized. Rebecca was staring at the screen in horror. They were grooming us, like predators groom children. That's exactly what they were doing, Michael confirmed. And once they'd identified a potential target, they'd arrange for David to accidentally meet her, at the grocery store, at community events, always in situations that seemed completely natural. I thought about all the times Patricia had insisted on accompanying me to social events. All the women she'd chatted with while I stood silently by her side. Women I'd thought she was just being friendly to. How many women? I asked, afraid of the answer. Lisa consulted her notes. We've identified 12 women who were members of the support group and had subsequent contact with David. Of those, 5 definitely had affairs with him. We're still investigating the others. 12 women. 12 marriages potentially destroyed by my husband and his family's systematic manipulation. There's something else, Michael said grimly. We found evidence that Patricia has been running similar schemes for years, possibly decades. Before the Facebook group, she used church groups, community organizations, even PTA meetings to identify and target vulnerable women. He pulled out a box of old letters and documents. These belonged to David's father. After he died, Patricia kept all his papers hidden among his business documents. We found correspondence that suggests he was also involved in extramarital affairs, all following the same pattern. I picked up one of the letters dated 23 years ago. It was from a woman named Carol, thanking Patricia for her understanding and support during a difficult time in her marriage, and expressing gratitude for Patricia's introduction to a wonderful man who helped her remember what it felt like to be appreciated. My God, I breathed. This is generational. Patricia learned this from watching her own husband. And then she taught it to David. It's a family business, Rebecca said bitterly. Destroying marriages and manipulating women is literally the family business. Amanda stood up abruptly and walked to the window. Do you know what the worst part is? I actually liked her. Patricia, I mean. After David introduced us, she would call me sometimes just to chat. She'd tell me how happy she was that David had found someone who understood him, how grateful she was that I was bringing joy back into his life. She told me the same thing, Jennifer said. Made me feel like I was doing something noble, helping a good man survive a difficult marriage. I remembered Patricia's knowing smiles, the way she'd sometimes pat my hand sympathetically after David had been particularly cruel. She was getting satisfaction from both sides, I realized. She enjoyed watching David hurt me, and she enjoyed befriending the women he was using to justify that hurt. Michael nodded grimly. Patricia Peterson is a psychological predator. She feeds on the destruction of other women's lives and relationships, and she's been doing it for decades. What can we do about it? Rebecca asked. I mean, legally? Can we stop her from doing this to other women? We're building a case for criminal conspiracy and fraud, Lisa explained. The fake social media profiles, the forged documents, the systematic targeting of vulnerable women, it all adds up to a pattern of criminal behavior. But more than that, Michael added, we're going to make sure everyone knows what they've been doing. Every woman in that support group, every community organization Patricia has been involved with, every church and social club, they're all going to learn exactly what kind of predators they've been harboring. I looked around the table at these women who'd been victimized by my husband and his family. Despite everything they'd been through, they were here, willing to fight back, willing to expose the truth, even though it meant reliving their own pain and humiliation. There's something I need to tell all of you, I said. Something I've been thinking about since we started uncovering all of this. The room grew quiet. I spent 12 years making excuses for David's behavior. I told myself he was just going through a difficult phase, that his mother's influence was temporary, that if I just loved him enough, everything would get better. I paused, gathering my courage. But the truth is, I knew something was wrong long before I caught him cheating. I knew the way he and his family treated me wasn't normal. I just chose to ignore it because it was easier than facing the reality that my marriage was built on manipulation and abuse. Jennifer reached across the table and squeezed my hand. That doesn't make any of this your fault. I know that now, but I need you all to understand something. David didn't become a predator because of his mother's influence, or because of some childhood trauma, or because he fell into bad patterns over time. He's a predator because he chooses to be one. Every lie he told, every woman he manipulated, every cruel thing he said to me, those were conscious choices. What are you saying? Amanda asked. I'm saying we need to stop giving him excuses. We need to stop treating this like it's some kind of tragic misunderstanding or psychological illness. David Peterson is a calculating predator who systematically destroys women's lives for his own entertainment, and he needs to face consequences that match the severity of his crimes. Michael smiled proudly. That's exactly the approach we're taking. David, Patricia, and Janet are going to face both criminal and civil consequences, but more than that, we're going to make sure their methods are exposed so completely that no other woman will ever fall for their manipulations again. Rebecca looked around the table with determination in her eyes. What do you need from us? Everything, Michael said. Every text message, every email, every conversation you remember, every lie they told you, every manipulation they used. We're going to document it all and present it to the world. As the meeting broke up, I found myself standing with the 3 women who'd been my husband's other victims. We were strangers brought together by betrayal and manipulation. But looking at them, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. I felt sisterhood. Real, honest connection with people who understood exactly what I'd survived. Thank you, I said to each of them, for coming forward, for being willing to fight back, for helping me realize I wasn't crazy or oversensitive or any of the other things they tried to convince me I was. Thank you for having the courage to start this, Amanda replied. For refusing to let them get away with it. As I drove home that evening, I thought about the network of lies and manipulation that had controlled my life for so many years. David, Patricia, and Janet had built their whole world on the systematic destruction of other people's happiness. They'd turned cruelty into an art form and manipulation into a family tradition. But now, their victims were fighting back. And we weren't fighting alone. We were fighting together, armed with the truth and determined to make sure no other woman would suffer what we'd suffered. The predators had finally met their match, and we were just getting started. 6 months after that night when David spit in my face, I stood in the courthouse, watching him being led away in handcuffs. The judge had just sentenced him to 18 months in prison for conspiracy to commit identity theft, fraud, and systematic harassment. Patricia had received 2 years. Janet got 15 months. But more satisfying than the prison sentences was watching their entire world crumble in the months leading up to this day. The local newspaper had run a series of articles about the Marriage Manipulation Network, as they dubbed it. Every detail of their systematic predation had been exposed. The fake support group, the decades of targeting vulnerable women, the psychological warfare they'd conducted against their victims. All of it was now public knowledge. David had lost his job within days of the story breaking. Paul Richardson had made sure of that. Patricia had been asked to stop attending services at her church, and Janet's employer, a family counseling center, had terminated her immediately for conduct incompatible with our mission of supporting healthy relationships. But the social consequences, devastating as they were, paled in comparison to the civil judgments. Rebecca, Amanda, Jennifer, and I had filed a joint lawsuit for intentional infliction of emotional distress, conspiracy, and fraud. The settlement had been substantial enough to ensure that none of us would ever have to worry about financial security again. More importantly, it had funded something I'd never imagined I'd be part of creating. Sarah. Michael appeared beside me as the courthouse emptied. The reporter from Channel 7 wants to do a follow-up interview. Are you up for it? I nodded. Over the past few months, I'd become something I'd never expected to be, an advocate, a voice for women who'd been systematically manipulated and abused by people who were supposed to love them. The interview took place on the courthouse steps, with the reporter asking questions I'd answered dozens of times by now. But I never got tired of telling the story, because each time I told it, another woman somewhere recognized her own experience and realized she wasn't alone. Mrs. Peterson, the reporter asked, what would you say to women who might be experiencing similar manipulation in their own relationships? I looked directly into the camera, thinking about all the women who might be watching, women who were living the life I'd escaped from. I'd tell them that love shouldn't make you smaller, I said. Real love doesn't require you to apologize for existing, or to accept cruelty disguised as honesty, or to make yourself invisible to keep the peace. If the people in your life are systematically destroying your self-worth, that's not love. That's abuse. After the interview, I drove to my new house. Not an apartment anymore, but a real house, with a garden and windows that let in actual sunlight. It was smaller than the house I'd shared with David, but it was entirely mine, chosen by me, decorated according to my tastes for the first time in 12 years. Rebecca was waiting on my front porch with a bottle of champagne and a folder full of papers. It's official, she said, holding up the documents. The Peterson Awareness Foundation is now a registered nonprofit organization. We decided to formalize our advocacy work, creating a foundation that would help other women recognize and escape from systematic manipulation. Rebecca had used her settlement money to fund it, and Amanda and Jennifer had both committed to serving on the board of directors. How many women have contacted us this week? I asked as we settled in my living room. 7, Rebecca said, consulting her notes. 3 of them are situations we think might require immediate intervention. And we got a call from a prosecutor in Ohio who thinks she's identified a similar network operating in Cincinnati. It turned out that the Peterson family's methods weren't unique. Across the country, there were other predators using similar tactics to systematically destroy women's lives. Our foundation was helping to identify and expose them, one case at a time. My phone rang and I saw Amanda's name on the screen. Sarah, turn on channel 12 right now, she said without preamble. You need to see this. I grabbed the remote and switched channels. The evening news was showing footage of a woman being arrested outside what looked like a community center. The reporter was explaining that she'd been running a support group that was actually a front for targeting vulnerable women for manipulation and exploitation. That's exactly what Patricia was doing. Rebecca breathed. Same tactics, same predatory behavior. And she probably learned it from Patricia, I replied. Or someone like her. These techniques get passed around, shared among predators like some kind of twisted knowledge base. The news story continued, explaining that the arrest had come about after several women had recognized the patterns described in recent media coverage of the Peterson case and contacted authorities. We're making a difference, I said. And for the first time in months, I felt genuine pride in what we'd accomplished. Later that evening, after Rebecca had gone home, I sat in my garden with a cup of tea, watching the sunset. It had been exactly 1 year since I'd first discovered David's affair. 1 year since I'd begun the process of reclaiming my life. The woman I'd been then, frightened, broken, convinced that her worth depended on other people's approval, felt like a stranger to me now. I'd thought that woman was weak, that she'd somehow deserved the treatment she'd received. But I understood now that she'd been strong in ways I'd never appreciated. She'd survived years of systematic psychological torture, and still retained enough sense of self to recognize when something was wrong. My phone buzzed with a text from Jennifer. Asterisk saw the news about the Ohio arrest. We're really doing this, aren't we? We're actually changing things. Asterisk, I typed back. We're just getting started. And it was true. The Peterson Awareness Foundation was already working with law enforcement agencies in 6 states, helping them identify and prosecute similar networks. We created educational materials for counselors, social workers, and clergy to help them recognize the signs of systematic manipulation. We'd established a confidential hotline for women who thought they might be victims. Most importantly, we'd refused to be ashamed of what had happened to us. Instead of hiding our experiences, we'd turned them into weapons against the people who'd tried to destroy us. A year ago, I'd been a woman whose husband spit in her face while his family applauded. Tonight, I was a woman who'd brought down a network of predators and was working to ensure that no other woman would suffer what I'd suffered. The transformation still amazed me sometimes. My neighbor, Mrs. Chin, waved from her garden next door. She was an elderly woman who'd become something of a friend over the past few months, often stopping by with homemade soup or just to chat. How did the court proceedings go today? She called over. Justice was served, I replied. Finally. She nodded approvingly. Good. That family got exactly what they deserved. It was a sentiment I'd heard from dozens of people over the past few months. Far from being ostracized for exposing David's crimes, I'd found myself embraced by a community that was horrified by what the Peterson family had been doing in their midst. The women from Patricia's church had reached out to apologize for not recognizing what was happening. Several of David's former colleagues had contacted me to share their own suspicions about his behavior that they'd never felt comfortable voicing before. Even Paul Richardson, Rebecca's ex-husband, had contributed a substantial donation to our foundation, saying he wanted to help prevent other men from being victimized by these schemes, because that was another thing we'd learned. David's affairs hadn't just destroyed the lives of his female victims. They'd also devastated the husbands of those women, men who'd lost their marriages and often their children because of the Peterson family's manipulations. As darkness fell, I went inside and made myself dinner, a simple meal, but one I'd chosen and prepared exactly the way I liked it. Such a small thing. But for years, I'd cooked only what David and his family preferred, adjusting my taste to accommodate theirs until I'd almost forgotten what I actually enjoyed eating. Now I knew. I liked spicy food, exotic flavors, dishes that Patricia would have dismissed as too ethnic or too complicated. I liked trying new recipes, experimenting with ingredients I'd never been allowed to use in my old kitchen. I liked being myself, fully and unapologetically. After dinner, I opened my laptop and began working on my book. The Marriage Trap: How to Recognize and Escape Systematic Manipulation would be published next year, with all proceeds going to the foundation. My editor thought it could reach hundreds of thousands of women who needed to hear this message. The first chapter began with the night David spit in my face, but the rest of the book was about so much more than that moment of ultimate humiliation. It was about the years of subtle conditioning that had led to that moment, the systematic erosion of my self-worth, the careful isolation from friends and family, the gradual rewriting of reality that had made me question my own perceptions. Most importantly, it was about the process of fighting back, the months of secret preparation, the careful documentation of abuse, the building of a support network, the legal battle, and finally the creation of something positive from the wreckage of my marriage. As I wrote, I thought about all the women who would read these words. Women who were living in situations similar to what I'd escaped from. Women who'd been convinced they were crazy, oversensitive, or impossible to please. Women who'd lost themselves so completely they weren't sure who they were anymore. I wanted them to know what I'd learned, that they weren't crazy, that their perceptions were accurate, that they deserved better. I wanted them to understand that love shouldn't hurt, that family shouldn't be a weapon, that they had the right to exist without apologizing for taking up space. And I wanted them to know that if they were ready to fight back, they wouldn't be fighting alone. At midnight, I closed the laptop and prepared for bed and a conference call with our board of directors about expanding our services. But tonight, I was just Sarah Peterson, a woman who'd reclaimed her life from people who tried to steal it. A woman who'd turned her pain into purpose, her victimization into victory. As I turned off the lights and settled into my own bed in my own house, I thought about that night 6 months ago when I'd walked away from David's saliva on my face. I'd had no idea then what I was walking toward. I was walking toward freedom, toward purpose, toward a life where I mattered, where my voice was heard, where my existence was celebrated rather than merely tolerated. I was walking toward myself, and I'd never been happier to arrive. Have you ever had a moment where you realized the game was over and you had to fight for yourself? I really want to hear your thoughts in the comments below.